So the government came in and they said, we found the coffers empty. It is exactly what they meant. It's not that they didn't find money in central bank.
So for someone who does not understand, what is carbon credits? We already understand the concept of trading the future. What is carbon credits? And what is this concept of trading? Like this, like selling air, right?
They bring in a lot of money. And sometimes you see we celebrate and say, oh, we had an oversubscribed Eurobond, for example.
Yes.
But do we understand what that means? It is hard for you to steal from a poor person.
So that's why they sold us first.
Absolutely.
No, wait, rudi nyuma kidogo. Like the government is planning on people doing crimes, people breaking traffic laws.
Absolutely.
So that the government can use that money.
Yeah, absolutely. All penalties and fines are sources of revenue for any budget. It is one of the streams of revenue collection for government. In fact,
And people talk about crime does not pay. Wait, the Kenyan government is not in control of our tax policy. Please break it down for us.
Right. So to understand where we've come from as a country, so you must understand our relationship with the IMF and the World Bank.
Yes.
So you see the history of the IMF and the World Bank, they were formed in the 1945-46. And these two banks were formed to try compensate for the damages
Of the World War.
after World War II.
Yes.
But upon setting up these banks,
Yes.
over time they got to a place where they expanded their mandate beyond Europe and started thinking, can we then use this infrastructure to support growing economies? So countries like Kenya, for example, became members of the IMF in 1964, after independence.
Yes.
But throughout this time, we had been members of IMF through the British colony, as a British colony. And therefore, a lot of policy was already in place in terms of how we relate to the market. So the IMF is blamed for many, many things, including cannibalizing GDPs. So how the IMF works, so the World Bank is supposed to be give what you call long-term lending for development. But the IMF is for financial easing. It's actually called your short-term lending.
Like a Shylock.
Perhaps you say in the sense that they give you what you call short-term debt. But the World Bank debt is very long-term because it's developmental loans. So most of it is supposed to have infrastructure.
Yes.
So these loans are called concession loans because they are given in exchange for a concession. So the criticism,
You give something up?
Yes, you must give something up for you to receive it. The biggest problem with the IMF is that the concessions that have been in place, a lot of people criticize them for being too aggressive, forcing African countries to transfer their factors of production to Western states through their companies and so forth. But of course, what that happens is that it starts affecting the GDPs of this country. So GDP, plainly explained, is how much the government is spending, plus how much the private is spending, you and I, plus all investments made by government, plus balance of trade. So balance of trade is a balance between imports and exports. We usually say that positive balance of trade means that we are exporting more than we are consuming locally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
And lastly, for you to be able to get a clear picture for GDP, you need to insert a factor in inflation. So over the years, African countries have been managing GDP by using what you call, they don't use the real GDP because nominal GDP is the one that doesn't factor in inflation. So we can say we've grown by these many basis points, but we've not factored in inflation. And therefore, you can find many times we've actually not made any progress. Or we could have actually have grown the economy, but because we're not factoring in inflation, the economy is actually going backwards, but we feel like we are growing if we don't factor in inflation. Now, the IMF and the World Bank were set up then to provide this extra support for developing nations. But over time, that has become now a big challenge. So when a country like Kenya goes to get finances from IMF, they will have a document called a letter of intent. And the letter of intent will spell out conditions. Some of those conditions are based on things that the government must do for them to access funding. Some of those things are to limit government expenditure, index on corruption, You have indexes that touch on governance. So there are conditions, and there are some actually major ones that touch on economic performance.
Aren't those good things?
Well, they are looking from different sides, because African countries don't have are not very strong democracies, in the sense that whereas we elect our leaders, we have no proper control of our leaders because of how our politics are structured. They're good things, because the IMF then pushes for compliance with a minimum standard of regulation for you to access this, and that keeps a lot of African countries disciplined. But on the other side, they're equally disadvantageous, because it prevents the African countries like Kenya from controlling their economic policy. So, case in point, they'll say, we want you to demonstrate your growth by X% in terms of internal revenue collection. And that's where the government comes back and says we need to tax more to fulfill a fiscal requirement for you to access additional loans. And that's why sometimes when you look at the finance bill, for example, you wonder, is in the president or is in treasury part of this country, can they see we can't afford? But because of the extra policies that come with conditions for borrowing, make it impossible for you to dictate how you're going to tax your people.
Is this after they've received the money? Yeah. Or is the finance bill, for example, a setup for they have to prove that they can tax more before they get this money? Or they get this money first and then they prove they can tax more?
So we assume we've been on a revolving debt, is it? So over time we've been borrowing and paying. So when you go to borrow at that round, it's just like your bank. If you have an existing loan and you want to borrow from your bank, you must demonstrate where will you get the extra money to pay. So the government must also show their forecast for revenues and say, we are forecasting to introduce this tax, because introduce this tax will collect X amount, and that X amount is going to translate into money we can use to repay you the IMF or the World Bank or whichever syndicate loan they're taking. So that demonstration is important. But then what has happened is that demonstration has now become bigger than the actual reason why it's been asked for. So therefore the government starts taxing, not because they intend to collect it, they're taxing to demonstrate a fiscal position. So even currently, when we ask about the current finance bill, who is talking about whether we were able to achieve the targets from the Finance Bill 2023? The Finance Act 2023 introduced a lot of taxes, is it? But still, we only performed, I think, 65%.
65%?
Yeah.
And they're adding more.
So we ask the question, didn't it matter that you first achieved this 100% before you tax more?
Was it possible to repeat the finance bill, that the punitive finance bill of 2023, to try and expand the percentage? The same bill as was it possible to have the same bill extended to this new year?
Absolutely. So and this is the thing that we are not discussing as a country. So the budget making process is a long process. But unfortunately for many Kenyans, the budgeting process for us is the finance bill.
Yes.
So the budgeting process under Section 220 of the Constitution starts with budget estimates. So the budget estimates are sent to Parliament by the three arms of government. So the executive will send,
yes,
the legislature will send, and the judiciary will send budget estimates. And budget estimates will simply say, this is the amount of money we need to run our ministries for growth, for expansion, and so on and so forth. So those three budget estimates are presented before Parliament for discussion. Now, what we've been missing is when you discuss and say we are going to spend the X amount, if you don't question at that stage, why do we need to increase, to renovate the DP's house by X amount you're proposing, then your MPs or our MPs miss the chance to query that, so that then that does not become part of the revenue needed when you come to tax people.
So that's why they sold us first.
Absolutely.
In the initial discussion.
Absolutely.
Where they should have said something.
Absolutely.
They just show up to vote.
Absolutely. Because why isn't anyone discussing right now? How did we end up with erroneous budget estimates? How will we be discussing increasing, renovating office of the deputy president at the expense of growing commerce? It doesn't make sense.
Some people are arguing that the amount of the figures Kenyans are looking at, and this is a very simplistic approach, the figures are inconsequential. ati out of a budget of 3 trillion closing in on 4 trillion, kitu kama 2 billion is pocket change.
No, but look at it this way. So if you look at the breaking down the numbers, so you look at the appropriation bill, and it starts by saying, having seen the allocation, so Parliament sits, and they are going to give, they are going to knock off figures.
Yes.
So if you look at the figures currently,
yes,
you will see that we are giving, I think, a similar amount to Parliament and similar amount to the executive government. So essentially meaning the budget for running government is more or less equal to the budget we give in Parliament, the legislature.
So Parliament, their work is legislation, the payment of MPs, their allowances and stuff, and is equal to the amount of money that has been allocated to run government.
Absolutely.
And running government, executive, you're talking about, where I want to know where the payment of salaries is, the wages.
So the wage bill of the executive is where you have the biggest cost, is it? So we are paying for parastatal expenditure, we are paying salaries for this, we are paying salaries for that, we are paying for the DP's office, the office of the president, and those are the current expenditures that need to be rationalized. But see, when we present these budgets for discussion, budget estimates, the executive should not be given the free will to come up with figures that they cannot support, is it? And prudence requires, and actually I've seen that the issue is not about the finance bill as such. The issue is about prudence. It's asking, before we start taxing sanitary towels, for example,
yes,
are there things would have actually reduced?
Yes.
So that you don't have to go to that extent.
Yes.
You get? So if you look at that, if you look at the bill, and actually it's actually public information, you'll see they will slash down the allocation to the judiciary. But there's insignificant reduction of the current expenditure of government.
Okay.
And those are not the big questions. If I was an MP and they came to vote for the finance bill. So far the finance bill is just one of 4 measures of collecting revenue to fund the budget.
One of 4 measures?
One of 4. So we have tax-based measures, which is where the finance bill comes in. We have non-tax-based. And non-tax-based are your penalties, levies, those things.
They are budgeted for?
They are budgeted for.
No, wait. Rudi nyuma kidogo. Like the government is planning on people doing crimes, people breaking traffic laws.
Absolutely.
So that the government can use that money.
Yeah, absolutely. All penalties and fines are sources of revenue for any budget. It is one of the streams of revenue collection for government. In fact,
and people talk about crime does not pay. Wait, the government budgets for that?
It is there. And it is so elaborate, by the way, that the government does not budget on a yearly basis. The forecast, right now, what you call the revenue, expenditure, loans and grants document presented by Treasury. That document has budgeted from 2022 to 2027.
Ed, wait.
So it's not a surprise. It's not like government comes up and decides, oh, today we are going to increase. No, it's a long-term thing, 5 years.
We are only talking about the finance bill. Take us through these 4 elements where these 4 corners the government is getting money, and we're only focusing on one.
So the first one is tax, and we've discussed tax.
Yes.
Tax, there are 3 classes of taxes.
Yes.
So you will tax income-based tax.
Yes.
So income tax, which taxes income, which is your salary, profits, and capital gains.
Okay.
And capital gains is when you sell properties, dispose things, the amount of money you pay in capital gains. Yeah.
Yes.
The second one is non-tax. Non-tax models are the ones that tax now your penalties, social security funds, NSSF contributions, sale of goods and services. So if the government decides to sell buildings, like they were proposing to sell KCC,
yes,
fines and penalties, together with sale of non-financial assets. So sale of non-financial assets is anything else apart from bonds and T-bills. Every other sale the government does is actually considered a tax source of revenue. Now the third one is are your grants.
Grants?
So grants are basically classified into grants from foreign governments, grants from foreign institutions.
So and grants from Dubai, like the 200 million jet.
For example,
that's not counted.
If they are quantified as a grant, it should be a grant. If it's given by a foreign government, it should be captured under the line of grants from foreign governments. So foreign governments give us a lot of money for development, for programs. So China will give us some money, USA will give us some money. So those are grants from foreign governments and foreign institutions. They are still factored in as part of the budget revenues. Now the third one that nobody is discussing, which for me is the biggest concern.
The third one is the grants.
The third one is the grants, international grants.
We have the non-tax, we have the grants.
Yes, and the last one are the financial assets and liabilities.
Okay.
And this is where the crux of the matter is. So financial assets will cover your domestic borrowing and foreign borrowing.
Okay.
So any money we borrow from the IMF, we borrow from the World Bank, we borrow as a non-concession commercial loan,
yes,
we borrow from the public through T-bills, through government bonds, is also a source of revenue to fund our budgets. So you see why it is very, very unfair for Treasury to seem as though if we don't tax people punitively, then we have no other way around it. Truthfully, they have extra avenues of collecting, is it? So pick an example of fines and penalties. So instead of slicing money from the judiciary, why don't you send the judiciary so that it's more efficient, then penalties and interest can actually be paid for those who commit crime, is it? Instead of giving up and say we only need to tax you more, tax sanitary towels and do those things, why don't you improve NSSF collections? Because NSSF collections are a source of budgeting, is it? So it's very, very unfair when MPs now come and say we are going to stop everything to discuss the Finance Act. We have never collected enough from the Finance Act. From a long time, we are always a deficit, always.
So how fair is this when we talk about the non-tax, like penalties, right? Someone goes to court for a criminal offense, for a traffic offense, right? So when the judge gives you a fine, you're fined as per the budget. You're fined as per a target they should raise. Is there a conversation like this?
So of course, legally, most penalties are prescribed, is it? So they are prescribed how if you overlap, the penalty is already in the law.
So the government knows some of us will overlap.
Absolutely.
And they plan on it. So why do you arrest me if I'm benefiting the government? By overlapping, I'm funding the government.
And that's the thing. So if you want to increase collections for government, improve our judicial system, so that if you are arrested for a traffic offense, it should be easy for you to just swipe your card, they collect their fines, they let you go with it. But it shows bad faith when the government says we'll reduce from the judiciary, reduce from the police, not invest in the police force. Then yet again, we have an avenue such as penalties and taxes, penalties and fines that can actually fund the government, yet nobody's discussing that. You look at it even on the flip side. Look at penalties for failure to pay taxes on time. Look at penalties for failure to pay land rates. Look at penalties for operating without a business permit. All those penalties and fines are considered components of revenue for budget.
But what about the unintended effect of let's say you make the judiciary more efficient that we can swipe for overlapping, we can swipe for crossing a traffic light. Isn't that to make on the unintended consequence? Doesn't that make crime affordable such that you can walk around with a menu, you can perform the crimes you can afford?
It's true. You see, we know the first one. In all other countries, the collection system of the judiciary is very, very efficient because there's some offenses that don't require custodial sentences, meaning there's some offenses we can't arrest you and put you in custody because the cost of putting anyone in prison is an expense that you have to acknowledge in your budget. In our budget, for example, there's an expense line tied to the prison service. So a good economy knows that for taxes, for penalties and offenses that are what you call misdemeanors, overlapping, overspeeding, you don't want to tie those so much to a court process because then that ties up more expenses. Secondly, the cost of running that system is very expensive.
What if the government is abducting people to look for alternative sources of revenue?
No, about abducting, first, it's illegal. I mean, it's not even a source of any revenue for anyone. It just increases the cost of the cost of actual the efficiency of judicial system. So if you abduct us, so a lawyer has to go and court file for an application for habeas corpus so that they are released. Then they have to serve the AG, and then the AG has to, or serve the DPP. The DPP has to instruct lawyers.
And
the government knows where you are, is it?
But the government will make 100K per abduction. Maybe.
You do realize equally, one of the expenses attached to the judiciary is that the DPP also is sued. People sue the DPP for compensation.
Oh, so they also lose this money?
They also lose this money. If you abduct me, if you hold me wrongly for more than 24 hours, once I'm released, I can actually file a petition for compensation for injury or damages.
Okay.
And therefore, that's also a cost to government. So it's not like the government can actually cannibalize the criminal system to make more money.
Okay.
Because of course we have a process of fairness that is in the Constitution.
Okay. So you are at financial assets and liabilities.
So financial assets and liabilities are classified into two major parts. So domestic borrowing and your foreign borrowing.
Yes.
What I was explaining about domestic borrowing.
Yes.
So domestic borrowing is anytime the government is floating a T-bill or a bond. It's essentially the government coming back to us as citizens to borrow money from us.
And before you explain further, does this mean, okay, again, I've answered myself partially, but when the government invests in T-bills for us to build our country, if the platform was opened up to more people, it becomes a viable investment that the government borrows. Will that be a faster way for development?
So a part of government borrowing is to also stimulate and stabilize the economy. So you have resources that are what you call risk-free investments. Yeah. So the government does that to create a risk-free basis for investment in the country. And actually, by the way, also doing that is a vehicle to attract investors.
Yes.
The challenge comes in when the government overborrows domestically. And what I was explaining is that if the government gets to a threshold where we are at 50% domestic, 50% foreign, it means that the financial system starts shrinking. The case in point, for example, in Ghana, when the government was aggressively borrowing domestically,
yes,
the banks were only lending to the government. And what happens, so all banks, even the Central Bank of Kenya, the Act itself, has a requirement for single obligor requirement. So meaning that the bank cannot take all its money, give to one person. The central bank doesn't allow that. Because of the risk of that person defaulting in paying, then the whole financial system will collapse, is it? So they're supposed to distribute this across different people.
Yes.
But when a government is aggressively borrowing domestically, many banks will actually go beyond the single obligor requirement. And when they pass that threshold, they are doing it with the confidence that the government never defaults. And it's true. A government is not known for defaulting on its domestic borrowing. So we expect if I buy a bond, after every 6 months, I expect to be paid back.
Yes.
And the government so far hasn't defaulted. So it's a very safe bet. When the government overly borrows domestically, then that creates a challenge in the sense that now the bank doesn't feel the need to loan to riskier people. They loan to government. And that is actually causing a serious rise in the bank lending rates.
Yeah. And we already agreed that it's impossible to do business at such high interest rates.
Absolutely.
Again, we'll go back to realistic returns on investments on the sure bet businesses. We are talking 8% to 10 to 12% for the most part. So you cannot borrow at 22% to repay a business that gives you 12% of the max.
Doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And I say, you see, we usually measure business success on the basis of the return rate on a T-bill. So if the T-bill return rate is better than the cost of entrepreneurship, of course, it's a no-brainer.
Go for the T-bill.
Take your money, give it to the government then. Save yourself from entrepreneurship. Now you see, if you give your money to the government and don't go the entrepreneurship route, the GDP suffers because of private consumption. And that's why it's like a very bad position to find yourself in when the government is really borrowing domestically, because it actually starts killing entrepreneurship.
before we break down the financial assets and liabilities, why can't we, as in, who sold us? Who sold us? I've always held the opinion that the position we are in is a compound effect of bad manners from independence, right? But then we talk about, President Kibaki turning things around and a breakdown of probably future prospects. And again, I don't know, who sold us?
So it's been a progressive, as you said, it's been a progressive problem. And actually, I say, by the way, our generation and the generation behind us, we are the ones who are supposed to be rioting. Our parents' generation should not be rioting because it is money stolen from us many years ago that we are now paying right now. And this is how it happens. If I keep going back to to my bank and saying, whereas you gave me 100 million last month, I want to borrow another 100 million. Then the bank asks me, how will you pay? And I'll tell them, in future, this is what I'm going to collect. And the bank gives me money. Essentially, I am pledging that debt on the future of my kids. And that's what has been happening. We go to IMF, we give concessions. And they'll say, well, one of the concessions that you must set up an EPZ in place X. And out of that, you must allow American companies, for example, to come and do certain form of trade there and give them tax holiday, give them all these investment deductions and so on and so forth. When they come and reap from that extension you've given them, we already have the money. But who's going to pay the money? It's not going to be paid by the current government. It will be paid by the future government, is it? Mm-hmm. And there has been a reckless borrowing for infrastructure that countries don't need. And in that process, we enslave the future generations. So rightly said, the generations rioting right now are supposed to be doing that right now because in any case, it is money we are paying that they have not yet benefited from. Money borrowed in 1970s or 80s. Or even say
what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean?
Doesn't benefit you in any way.
The debt that we are talking about is not debt that was borrowed by, okay, it's been placed on the doorstep of the previous regime, right? So people have not even suffered the consequences of the previous regime. That's for our grandchildren.
Absolutely.
So we are suffering for the 80s guys.
We are suffering for debt that was borrowed a long time ago. And you see why we are suffering for it? Is because if the government had not given these concessions to to factors of production, then we would be able to actually pay them by increasing our exports, is it?
So are you saying this government is innocent?
No government is innocent. If you look at the government has done, I'll show you what the government has done, I'll show you the numbers. What the government has done since 2022 and what they intend to do 2027. There is no innocence. They are still doing the same thing.
So you break it down for us.
So if you look at now the foreign assets, and allow me to show you.
Please.
If you look at the foreign assets, where we are discussing that the government now is going to invest from domestic borrowing. So there are various classes of domestic borrowing.
Yes.
Or foreign borrowing. So foreign borrowing, there's something called, of course, borrowing, the usual and everyone knows. We borrow from IMF and the World Bank. Those are international foreign institutions that give us debt on concession. And I've said concession many times because concession means it's quid pro quo. We give you something, our interest rate is very low, but in the process, you make a concession for maybe giving free trade or whatever it is in the form of concession. But we equally have what we call the exchequer payments. So if you look at the appropriations bill, there's a place that they discuss and say payments from exchequer. So exchequer, it means, is an equivalent of, for lack of a better word, is an overdraft. So we have an overdraft with IMF, for example.
Yes.
Where that means that our exchequer, which is the equivalent of the treasury, the department that controls payments,
and
over time, in disbursements, over time they borrow from that fund as a revolving fund. So the exchequer payments are actually based on a ceiling. When you get to a certain ceiling, you can no longer access it. You need to create fiscal space. So the government came in and they said, we found the coffers empty. It is exactly what they meant. It's not that they didn't find money in central bank, but there was no headroom for additional borrowing.
Money was there, but they could not borrow more.
They could not borrow more.
That's what empty coffers meant.
Absolutely. And I tell you that it is hard for you to steal from a poor person. So
it is hard for you to steal from a poor person.
Why?
What has the Kenyan government been doing?
The Kenyan government isn't stealing from us. The Kenyan government, there is nothing to steal from us. If you're operating on a deficit in the economy, what is there to steal from? We don't have money to be stolen from. So the government is stealing from future generations.
Oh, so
they're not stealing from this current generation, they're stealing from the future generations. The same way right now, we're suffering debt that was taken by generations ahead of us.
So wait, the effect you are feeling now is for the generations that passed.
Absolutely.
But now, what the mistakes they are doing now, people have not even tasted the suffering.
Unless something happens, and unless something as drastic as what's happening right now happens, where the government is pushed more to account, then we are likely in generations to come, those generations will really, really suffer. Because essentially, we start stealing from future generations and committing resources we don't have now that we hope to get in the future.
Yes.
We get to a place where the room for borrowing, and I can actually show the numbers and see that the room for borrowing has been shrinking over time. The IMF has been saying, no, it's no longer feasible. So when these guys came into government, and as a president, when you come into government, the first thing in Africa you want to ask yourself is, how do I fund my development agenda? That's your first question, is it? They've elected me, I was elected on the promise of development. How do I fund it? So to go back and ask, who are the partners we usually borrow from, and how do we sit with them? So you'll find, look at IMF and you find actually in IMF we are almost defaulting. So go to IMF, they tell you, by the way, we can give you money, but Kenya is not in a good place. When they send out their letter of intent,
yes,
they say you must demonstrate collection of additional revenue. Case in point, COVID-19, when COVID-19 hit Kenya, the Kenyan government went to IMF, for example, to ask for money. In the application, the letter of intent required them to demonstrate how they were going to fund repayment. What did the government do? Quickly came back, introduced an amendment to the finance bill of, I think, 2018 or 2019. They came and introduced a tax called the minimum tax.
On turnover for businesses.
Yeah, on businesses and make
the 1%.
1% for your gross turnover you make.
Yes.
It was so draconian. In fact, there's nothing in this current finance bill that is as backward as that tax.
No, there is. The motor vehicle circulation tax.
See, if you're saying you're going to tax me for making a loss, you do realize I can do a lot of business, 100 million, but if my profit margin is 1%, I'm better off paying income tax than you charging 1% of the overall turnover, is it? Imagine if you were to do the same thing with KQ. KQ has a lot of gross revenue, is it? In terms of gross revenue, they have a lot of gross revenue, but in terms of what they call their net profit, there's nothing, they make losses. So these laws proposing, when KQ makes all this money, we take 1%. It would have killed the economy hands down within a year. But when we ask ourselves, why did the government make such a decision? They want to say the government made that decision because it doesn't understand that this tax is punitive? Of course not. The government is making this decision because it has been required through a letter of intent to demonstrate how they'll borrow. So they pledge to pass this law, they push and pass it, then they go back to IMF and say, we have made the conditions, then IMF will say, okay, this seems like it's right, here's the money.
Is it the same formula in terms of pledging the future? Is it the same formula with the carbon credits thing?
So and actually the discussion around carbon credits, I've seen a lot of, Kenya has really been aggressively borrowing against climate change, on the climate change fund. It's the same thing, we say we are pledging to trade our carbons because Kenya has a surplus of carbons and so forth. Truthfully, we are there. But responsible climate change that is sustainable is thinking about, instead of trading off all carbon credits we have, shouldn't we be having a sustainability project of saying, what happens the day we industrialize? You mean? So we can't trade what we have right now as though we'll never need it. So it's the same thing, is it?
Yes.
But because we are getting financing for pushing the carbon trading, so our president and our government is quickly going to take that as a fund. But what are we pledging it against?
So for someone who does not understand, what is carbon credits? We already understand the concept of trading the future. What is carbon credits? And what is this concept of trading it? Like this, like selling air, right?
So it is. So there is through the COP, or whatever you call COP 22, whatever it is, they have there's a threshold of how much greenhouse gases countries are allowed to emit as a responsible factor for sustainable production, sustainable industrialization. So there are countries
of the whole world.
Of the whole world.
Yes.
So there are countries that are already producing way more than they should.
Okay.
But then the carbon credit system is supposed to help those countries to compensate those countries that are not producing as much by buying carbon credits from them. So for example, hypothetically, the limit is 20. Kenya only gets to 2, meaning we have 18. And those 18 then are your carbon credits, meaning it is tradable. You can give it to someone else to increase their pollution, since you will not get there, is it?
We are not polluting enough, so for the people who know about how to handle pollution, we give our non-pollution to them.
Yes, so the more industrialized countries that are already getting to the threshold will come back to countries that are not there, and they can trade credits. So what
but we may not feel the effect now until we need it.
We will feel it, of course, definitely. In 10 years to come, when we industrialized, it will be a big question for African countries. So we've now actually made it impossible for us to industrialize.
But you also mentioned something about industrialization. Yes, I think this is attributable to you. That the global monetary system is fixed in such a way that it's impossible for Africa to industrialize.
Absolutely, and actually now, with the current factors of production, we've already given up too much. So one of the examples, for example, is in our Income Tax Act. One of the concessions for getting funding from IMF and then the rest, they would say, for you to spur your economy, we need you to give a 10-year investment deduction arrangement. So 10 years, it means if I put up a facility in Kenya for 10 years, I don't pay tax. Instead, the cost of that setup, I offset it from income tax for 10 years. And you look at the question and say, if these concessions were given in the 90s, how many local companies in the 90s could actually be able to set up? So eventually we gave up a lot of it to someone else for that period of time for funding now. So they've been deducting, and I'm saying that it becomes harder for you to set up, because by the time you come into setup, so right now the government is coming back and saying, oh, we've actually realized that investment deductions don't make sense, and therefore we want to reduce investment deductions. But if you start reducing investment deductions right now, you cannot isolate and say, I'm only going to remove it for foreign companies and leave multinationals with it. So we end up suffering, all of us. So because of those things that we've done over many, many years, it becomes very hard for you to set up an industry in Kenya. But the cost of production is very high, given because of our capital system. We borrow, it comes with concessions, we are paying high credit for it, we are paying many things on fuel. We are like in a place where we are not controlling our economy properly. So it becomes hard for us to industrialize. But even now with things like carbon trading, in the years to come, it is further taking industrialization further away from us, because our African presidents and African leaders are aggressively pushing to get money under climate change programs to build a sustainability program that they can actually trade our credits. But there should be a responsibility around how much you can trade, is it?
Yes.
So what is happening, and actually in Africa, is actually we are pledging the future nations to our current debt, which is really, really unfair. And that's what I was telling you, right now it's a discussion. It's not a discussion about the finance bill. It's a problem of ideology.
So of all these modes of raising revenue for government, before we check the numbers again, the tax, the non-tax, the grants, and the financial assets and liabilities, could we sustain an economy by focusing on one that does not hurt people?
There should be an even balance. In fact, the biggest form of funding for economy is the balance of trade. It is the only way we get out of debt. And the balance of trade meaning we need to support our industries to export more, so that we can actually have foreign exchange coming in, and that foreign exchange will give reserves in the foreign reserves will be good for us. then over time, Kenya can start building an economy where the government does not aggressively borrow from the foreign market and domestically, meaning we can start strengthening the shilling, isn't it?
Yes, 100%. But then, okay, the shilling was at 160. It's going down at 130. That's not progress.
There's none. See, if you look at the numbers of the current government, the government took up in 2022.
Around, I think, 115.
So that's where the whatever was. That's where the shilling was.
Yes.
And given it was not their problem that the dollar was gaining. It was a factor of many things. The Ukrainian war, inflation, all those things were causing the shilling to move up.
Okay.
But we've seen a drastic fall of the shilling. And you ask, how? But you look at the numbers, it will tell you why. Because since the government came in, the government has actually increased borrowing from what you call commercial loans. So the government is no longer going to IMF and the World Bank.
Yes.
The government now is going to what you call the global Shylocks.
Yes.
And what that has done is that they bring in a lot of money. And sometimes you see we celebrate and say, oh, we had an oversubscribed Eurobond, for example.
Yes.
But do we understand what that means?
An oversubscribed Eurobond. I brought that up in a separate conversation with Rina Hicks, and I think it went along the lines of, in fact, most of the people who buy those bonds are not Kenyans.
Now Kenyan can buy. Kenyans don't participate in the Eurobond market. A negligible percentage. In fact, the only ones who can participate perhaps are your institutional investors, the bigger pension funds are the ones who participate. Wow. So
are you saying that the people who pride in, I'm investing in bonds,
that is domestic borrowing. So pride, you see, domestic borrowing are your treasury bonds and treasury bills.
Yes.
That is domestic. So sovereign bonds is when Kenya now goes to the global market.
Yes.
To borrow from the global market. And they'll say, we are looking for 1 trillion, for example.
Yes.
Then the global market will ask, how much are you going to pay us in return? So you know why we usually subscribe? It's because African countries will go and offer ridiculous numbers. So the global return, for example, is at 5%. African countries will say, we can actually give you 12%.
Yeah.
Why would it be oversubscribed? Everybody is going to put money in it, is it? If you're a global fund and you have an African country saying we're going to pay you 12%, yet the rate in the market is at 7%, there'll be more people willing to give you money, isn't it?
Yes.
And that is the figures that come into countries like Kenya because they are inflows. Truthfully, they're inflows, but they're inflows that are short-lived.
Inflows that are short-lived. Short-lived in the sense that it's money it's like, what do we call it? Bandage Solutions.
Yeah.
In this sense, there's no way we can float a Eurobond at X percentage, use it responsibly, so that we can pay back and keep something.
And truthfully,
yes.
And there's a reason why commercial loans are going to kill African countries, especially Kenya included, if we don't address it.
Yes.
So the difference between borrowing from the IMF versus borrowing from the commercial market, the commercial global market, is because the commercial global market does not come with a lot of restrictions.
Now I get you. It's like microfinance.
Yeah, so they will not really overly regulate your policy, tell you to restructure your bank processes, tell you to restructure these fiscal easing. They'll not do that. Whereas they have conditions for corruption index, sustainability, good governance.
Yes.
They are too soft for countries that are already used to even inflate or manage their GDP with false numbers, cooking their GDP numbers. It is too soft.
So people basically they bite more than they can chew.
For sure. And what's happening right now is because we are not being asked all these questions. So African states now are now taking this money that doesn't come with a lot of what you call requirements. And because no one is following, okay, we took X amount of a Eurobond, how was it utilized? But if you take the same amount of money from the IMF, for example, the conversion is a bit harder because they're going to regulate, they're going to ask. So the shift from us running away from IMF borrowing from other related governments to move quickly to the global commercial market is really telling of where we are, and that's the bigger problem. We would rather borrow from the IMF and the World Bank because then they help us as Kenyans keep the government accountable.
There's a book that I think one of the most interesting books I've read, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I'm sure that has crossed your desk, right?
Richard
John Perkins.
John Perkins.
Yes, John Perkins. He explains that the IMF and World Bank, by default, are not designed to help you even with those restrictions. In fact, they're designed to stifle your development and stuff, and give you loans that you can never repay. So how are they the people who are now in this conversation coming across as the good guys?
So see, compare of the two evils. Commercial borrowing versus IMF borrowing.
The devil and his assistant.
You'd rather the IMF. You remember that African states have never had an economy without the IMF and the World Bank.
African states have never had an economy.
They've been part of us. Which African state was formed in 1945, apart perhaps from a few that you can mention?
Is that by design?
It's by design. African states were colonized by Europeans, isn't it? When the Europeans left, after the World War II, they formed through the Bretton Woods. I told you about the Bretton Woods Act that we still have as an act in Kenya, which was to establish a monetary system that regulates around the IMF.
Then that means all the financial system is a lie.
So the financial system is owned by the owners of capital. So
it's the new colonialism.
Absolutely, it's the new colonialism. And am I saying that the IMF is in a place where we can say they are doing a fantastic job? They have been criticized for a lot of things. Well, the biggest one including GDP shrinkage and increase in poverty.
GDP shrinkage and increase in poverty.
Absolutely, because when the IMF, for example, says we are telling the Kenyan government not to spend more on X. So austerity measures, which is reducing expenditure, has a significant way of affecting the GDP. When I told the GDP is government expenditure, private expenditure, investments, balance of trade, minus.
So government overspending is to our benefit.
It is.
Government overspending is to our benefit.
The government spends a lot. And that's what happens during Kibaki's time. You remember? It's not that Kibaki did anything unusual. It's only that the government now was receiving funds from the IMF and the World Bank, but was equally spending in investment projects. And that lifted the overall GDP. Did it reduce our overall balance of trade? Maybe not. But the government was then spending, is it? So when we have a scenario like now where the government is borrowing, but the government isn't spending, our GDP growth isn't there, but somehow we are still increasing our debt. You know, that's like the catch-22 situation you find yourself in. I'm saying compared to the IMF, the World Bank, versus borrowing from the commercial market, for African countries, we are better off with IMF and the World Bank because they can regulate government behavior. And they are known to do that. Whereas their policies might not always work for us, they are a better evil than going to tell someone who's in the global market, give us money. They don't ask what for. But we have committed the whole country to that sovereign debt. You and I cannot even hold, forget about the MP, even your MCA. You can't hold an MC accountable, is it? So why then would you want a financial system where people borrow from the foreign market, from the global commercial market, come back with the money, but we can't account how was it spent?
I'm very curious now. Let's talk the financial system. We've never been independent, right? Assuming we had a responsible government, if there exists anything of that kind. We talk about losing a third of our revenue on corruption. If a third of the revenue was spent wisely, with all the jinxes and GDP shrinkages in place, would we be in a better place?
For sure. So let me tell you something. The IMF has actually funded European countries. After the World War II, they were actually relying on funding from the IMF and the World Bank to rebuild their economies.
So the problem is not IMF?
IMF is a problem. When they mutated to become whatever they became and they were centered around global powers had more control than anyone else, then that created a bigger problem. But whereas they are a big problem for us, we cannot turn the entire blame on them because equally, economic prudence we don't have. So for example, why would someone borrow money from the IMF designed to build schools in the whole country? Then out of 100% performance, you only perform 60% and 40% goes to your pocket. You can't blame that on the IMF.
In which case, if we have a responsible government, I've always asked this question. Sawa, we've asked for accountability, and I think that's one of the root causes of the protests going on. We've asked for accountability, right? When we do the mathematics, right? Basic mathematics, sindio? You know who borrowed the money. Money always has a money trail. Yes, we borrowed 1 billion, right? We can only take account of 200 billion. If the government is serious, can they recover all that assets and put it back in the economy? Instead of borrowing, why can't we recover?
They can, and that's what we're saying, for example. If the government was prudent, they would actually say, if we implemented the Finance Act 2023 to 60%, you should be responsible to say 40% of the next budget will be met by the 40% we didn't achieve. You want to start there, is it? Because that means whatever reasons we didn't achieve it, you go back and ask why, is it? You'll ask, is it that we collect the money, but the money didn't get to treasury? Is it that now our economic system has become too porous that when we collect, it doesn't get to us? Those are the things you want to ask. And you want to go back and also ask, of all the money that has come into the country, how much of it did not go into the projects it was supposed to go into? You know, the reasons why the government struggle is because when the IMF or the World Bank audits, and they ask, guys, we don't see like this money is being put into correct use. No one speaks, is it?
Yes.
All of us go quiet. We've had scandals that are never resolved, is it? We have Anglo-leasing, we have all these things. But all these are monies borrowed from the country that will be repaid, is it? So so whereas we have African countries that are in an unfair position because of how the global economy is set up, there's a part of us that needs to rise up above this and start focusing more on prudence. So the little we get, we put into good use. The little we get, we put into microfinances. The little we get, we support, we don't take up projects that don't make sense. We don't invest in projects that will not benefit the whole country. Those are some of the things that can actually get out of it. But I see the government is also playing a long game. And the long game, I think, for the government is to realize that over time, our reliance on domestic borrowing is going to shrink our ability to grow the economy. And I was looking at the numbers, if you look at by the time we get to 2027, if the government keeps borrowing as it's borrowing, and of course the challenge of doing that is that it's borrowing commercially, they might actually bring that ratio of foreign debt to domestic to 70, 30%.
30% foreign, 70 domestic.
No, 70 foreign, 30% domestic, which is a good thing.
If they do things
But I haven't seen that the government is factoring repayment.
But they talk about, I think, around 7 shillings out of every 10 shillings going back to repaying debt. Debt that books that they are not willing to open to the public. Are they doing that because it's so ugly? Are they doing that because it's not in our place to know?
A majority of the debts that the government doesn't disclose openly is commercial debt. The IMF debt by this is many times accessible. The IMF produces a report indicating the borrowing index of African countries and how it's done. So that's available. It is the commercial debt that has created this space of lack of accountability. Because I've told you, if you borrow from a syndicate loan elsewhere, the owner of that loan will not ask you to have democratic elections, for example. Or the case for return, is it? They'll ask, what's the rate I'm getting? What are the guarantees you're giving? The government says we are backing this as a sovereign bond, meaning that the government is actually pledging. And you remember, the World Bank and the IMF actually have a ceiling for how much the Kenyan government can pledge in public debt.
Yes.
So when people say aggressively, we'll stop borrowing from these institutions, we want to turn and become sustainable. You don't become sustainable by borrowing from the commercial market, because the commercial market is the reason why most African states fail. Yeah?
Ow. So what are our options now?
First thing, what's happening is a good thing. It's time for people to have conversations around accountability. And for me, it's not about accountability by the president, it's accountability by all our leaders. Starting from the MCAs all the way to the president, we start having questions of accountability, is it?
Yeah.
We resolve some of the scandals we have. We don't sweep things under the carpet. And what's happening, and I've told you, is a discussion of ideology. It's about numbers. It's ideology. See, when you practice law, when you're a law student, we usually have a debate about law and morality.
Yes.
In first year, and we ask, what came before the other? Is it the law or morality? And that conversation goes on and on and on.
Never ends.
It never ends, because we can say, is it that morals exist because of laws, or laws exist because of morals? It's a hard conversation. But what I know for a fact is that ideologies are not founded on laws. Ideologies are founded on alignment of morality. And when a society comes together and their moral fiber is tied behind a common belief, then that discussion you can actually change by amending laws. You must join the discussion of these ideologies, is it?
Yes.
So the millennials and the Gen Zs are asking those questions. So we are paying debt at when unemployment is at the highest ever in the country. Is it?
Yes.
In our history since independence, it's actually at the highest, where we have graduates who have, not that they're looking for jobs, they stopped looking because there are no jobs, is it?
Yes.
And then you tell this group you're going to tax them more. So of course, the ideology of morality will ask, but how are we supposed to pay these taxes if currently you're even not offering a solution on how we'll get jobs? The government first is cutting down recruitment by the government. How is that a solution into taxing people? And therefore, the discussion of ideology now, the ideology of what's happening becomes a thing that the government needs to calm down and engage people and change the fabric. So even if, by the way, we sort this issue about the Finance Act, that discussion is unlikely to go away.
Okay. Is there an alternative, before we look into the numbers again and before we close, is there an alternative to the IMF World Bank system? Like, can Kenya as a country come up with a formula that can set the country free from the chains of borrowing debt that puts that clamps the economy down? So
by the way, there are very few countries in the world that don't borrow.
Okay. Very few countries. A lot of countries borrow to finance infrastructure. What are these countries that don't borrow, and what do they do?
So predominantly the bigger players in the IMF, and these are the bigger players in the global market. Your USAs, your China's, your France, the bigger. But
the USA, in fact, owes, as in one of the biggest debtors to China is the USA.
From a balance of trade point of view, is it? Not in terms of aid. From a balance of trade point of view, and that can actually happen easily because they are the biggest trading partners in as much as they don't see eye to eye, is it? That can actually happen in terms of balance of trade. But I'm saying in terms of aid, developmental aid, for example, you'll find that they ordinarily do not,
So you can't exist outside the money system.
It is hard. The money system, even here, even locally, even from an individual point of view, it's very hard for you to make wealth without getting extra help. But the issue is not borrowing, is it? Even as an individual, if you borrow, that's not a problem. The problem is if you borrow and don't put it to prudent use, is it?
Prudent use. And I think this is a discussion for another conversation. I'm doing my research in terms of, like, okay, when you borrow to invest, cumulatively, the overall return on investment, realistic, that makes sense, sustainable, between 8 to 10%. No one gives you money less than 14%. No one, and this is annually, right? The SACCO. Our SACCO gives at 12 on average, Nation SACCO. But then, I don't know about the others. I don't know how much it's standardized for everybody.
It's standardized with us, right? Around 1%. If you're borrowing against member deposits.
Yes, per month. So the question now becomes, what is this business that you're investing in that gives you a return of more than you borrowed for?
So the idea is that you're borrowing capital, is it?
Yes.
So you only lose money from an investment point of view if you lose your capital. So long as your business can give you a return. So remember, you're paying, for example, 1% per annum, is it?
Yes.
From the SACCO point of view.
1%
the
per month.
23% is 1% per month, is it?
Yes.
So the 23% is an annual percent rate for the bank, is it? Meaning if you look at monthly what you're supposed to pay back, the interest rate is actually lower than the profit rate, is it? Because see, assuming you're making 14%, you're 8% per month on your business, is it?
No, per year. Because the return on investment, I was told that returns are counted annually for a reason. You have high months, you have low months, right? So on average, the average return on investment is between 8 to 10%.
But you see the way businesses work, is it?
Yes.
You don't repay your loans on a yearly basis.
But at the end of the year, you'll have paid X amount.
Absolutely. So the capital is given to you ahead of time. It's given upfront. I give you 20 million. You'll pay me after 5 years. The expectation is because I've given you 20 million in advance, then that capital should be able to sustain you to repay the debt.
Okay.
But at the same time, at the end of the year, you should still have your capital. You understand why prudence is important? Because at the end of the loaning period, you have a responsibility to still have that capital to deploy back into the business. And therefore, if you're prudent with loans, you don't have to go back to borrow for the same amount for the same reason.
So if you've taken a 5 million bob loan to repay in 5 years, the ideal situation is to cross the 5 years with 5 million when you're 5 million bob liquid.
Absolutely, not even liquid, either in cash or in a regenerating asset. And that's sometimes when you borrow for consumption. That's why you end up being in debt.
Yes.
And that's what we are doing as a country. We are borrowing for consumption.
So it's a game of buying time. So if you borrow, it's for you to make sure that within the repayment period, you sustain your capital at the very least. So your wealth is counted after the repayment period, what you're left with as capital.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, but when we build a system where we are consuming our capital, we borrow for paying rent, like borrowing to pay your rent. You do realize at the end of the month, you still have to borrow again.
Yes.
And that's what we're doing. It's loosely say that's what African governments are doing.
Yes.
So when I say about discussing prudence is to say the government needs to start thinking, because this is not sustainable. What are the ways we can actually borrow sustainably?
Okay.
And the conversation began many months before the finance bill. It began when those guys sat in parliament. There was a budget for estimates and revenues that was presented in parliament. They all voted aye. Now they can't go back and start saying, oh, we've realized this tax is too punitive. But if you've already told the government they can build for the DP his house.
These were approved.
They were approved. They approved. And these numbers are run. Actually, you can actually get them. It's called the estimates for revenues, expenses, loans, and grants. So if you go to Treasury, you'll find it.
So had Kenyans paid attention to this before, they wouldn't have caught us off guard with passing the bill.
Absolutely. If the MPs had said there is no way you can actually have this expense here, that expense here, remove this expense here, then we would have had a budget that was streamlined for where we are.
Where do these ideas come from? Who comes up with ideas like taxing a vehicle that you've already paid 50% tax on?
Treasury. But also, I've also told you that Treasury doesn't have autonomy in terms of what they tax or they don't tax. It is a game of fulfilling fiscal space for you to borrow more, is it? So they will say anything.
Yes.
They will say anything. Even for you, the bank tells you, I cannot give you money, you need to demonstrate how you'll pay. Isn't that how businesses end up cooking books and going back to the bank and saying, these are our forecasts? Whereas they have no intention to actually get that performance rate. And that's what we're doing. We just come up with taxation to fulfill a fiscal policy somewhere.
So, in summary, this finance bill, all the punitive suggestions they've given, is not about raising money for government, it's about increasing the limit to borrow.
It's true. So, if we are always collecting our taxes with a deficit, year on year, even a reasonable person would actually tell you, then it doesn't seem like actually increasing taxes helps this country. But who's asking, how did we survive last year with that deficit? I mean, we had a deficit. We had a deficit. We didn't collect what we were supposed to collect.
We did 65%.
How did the government fund the 35%? Where did it come from? Borrowing. So the government knows eventually will still borrow, but the government knows it can't go to the IMF or the World Bank or the commercial market empty-handed.
Kwani the IMF are fools that they don't know that this is a cycle that keeps on repeating every year.
So like any lender, the IMF, and that's some of the criticism they get, the IMF is in business of lending to African countries, so that to entrap them for poverty or not, that's a business, is it?
Yes.
Because it's a concession loan, is it? There's a concession, there's some level of security attaching to it. So if you go and pledge your house to the bank and use fake numbers to show the bank will actually do it, does the bank care whether you actually do it or not?
They are betting on your house.
They're betting on your house. And if you don't pay, they'll come and take your house. So the numbers you present are not useful. And that's what we're doing right now. And the honest conversations around budgeting are not about taxation. They're about estimates. How do you get these estimates in place? Who develops them? How do they develop them? For example, the lawyers, for example, should be asking the judiciary, let us see your estimates. In fact, it is public participation is needed during the estimate. But look at what happens to public participation. Our public participation is based on the finance bill. It is not useful. So, and that's why, for example, so I was actually seeing a clip that Treasury has written and saying, if you guys don't pass this Finance Act, we are going to scrap off recruiting the interns, the GSS interns. We will not be able to afford that. We are going to remove the extra 50 billion we give to counties. Why are they removing it right now? Rationalizing of the budget should have been done during public participation way before the finance bill.
So the finance bill is technically a distraction.
So the finance bill is actually not a distraction. The finance bill is an instrument for collecting.
It is an instrument for collecting, but for the conversation we're having now,
absolutely.
It's a distraction.
Absolutely. The emphasis we've given the Finance Act, the same emphasis should have given the estimate process, the proposals for estimates. Those are the numbers Kenyans should actually involve with. And the government should be able to rationalize and tell us why.
Wow. And hey, now how ugly, before we close, how ugly do the numbers look? You started with the exchequer. Thank you for that information. We learn every day. How ugly do the numbers look?
So let me give you just a journey of how it looks like.
Yes.
So domestic borrowing. In 2021, Kenya was borrowing 589 billion domestically.
Yes.
2022, it came down to 437. 2023, it has gone back up to 584. 2024, the government intends to borrow 622 billion, the highest number since 2021. Then they assume in 2025, that number will drop down to 258 billion. And I'll explain why. The last in 2026 is going to be 513 billion. Then 2027, they intend to borrow 443 billion. So if you look at the debt fluctuation, you also need to look at it against domestic, against foreign borrowing, is it? So all countries with the IMF have what you call a special drawing rights, what you call SDR.
Yes.
So the SDR is like a savings scheme with IMF. So when countries are in distress, they usually borrow from their SDR. You understand? Like for you, if you had a savings plan with your bank, when things are tough, you go and tell the bank, by the way, as you're saving for me, I want to release some money to meet immediate needs. So the last time the government took money from that SDR is actually in 2022. So there is no explanation whether we still have it or there is anything left. But 2023 to 2027, the government is saying it has no intention to draw from its savings.
They already took money from there.
There is no explanation why they're not drawing it. But it's safe to conclude, you're saying.
There is nothing.
It's either not there. Otherwise, why would we borrow if we have savings? So you go and get your savings fast. So from 2023 to 2027, the government does not indicate any retrieval from the SDR. So big question mark. Is it that the money isn't there? Or is it that we drew it? Or I don't know, but the government doesn't seem to be borrowing. But instead, it's borrowing heavily from the domestic market. Now, in terms of borrowing from institutional organizations, now these are your IMF and the rest, you'll see there has been a semblance of a flat line because of these extra regulations. So 2021, 48 billion. 2022, dropped down to 29 billion. 2023, 59 billion. 24, 34 billion. 25, they're saying they're going to get 45 billion. But 2026, the government is going to borrow 92 billion. Why?
This new tax bill.
True.
This is a justification.
They have a justification. They've actually increased the fiscal space. They can borrow more. And this is what I'm saying, that we are not taxing for purpose of collecting. We're taxing because we're creating space for building additional borrowing. So if they're going to borrow 92 billion in 2026, in 2027, the government is going to borrow 115 billion. How is it possible from 2021 to 2027 the government has moved almost 3 times in terms of borrowing from the IMF and the World Bank? Now, in comparison, borrowing from foreign governments, same trajectory, 44 billion 2021, 44 billion 2022, 89 billion 2023, 52 billion 2024, 2025, 68 billion 2026, 140 billion 2027, 176 billion. What is the explanation? Is it that we've increased our exports?
No.
So it is those things that the government cannot, we can blame everyone else, but there are things that the government needs to look at carefully and start asking, is this sustainable or not sustainable? Otherwise, we are actually pledging our children. By the time you're borrowing 167 billion, in 2027, what are we saying? And that's not the only borrowing. So you've got 2027, you borrowed 115 billion from international governments, you borrowed 176 billion from foreign governments. Then the loans now from commercial loans.
Yes.
Commercial loans now, the ones the government is borrowing through the Eurobonds and the rest. In 2021, the government did borrow. In 2022, the government borrowed 102 billion. In 2023, the government borrowed 270 billion. In 2024, the government borrowed 286 billion. In 2025, the government is going to reduce those loans and only borrow 168 billion. But why is it dropping? Because the government then, by 2025, the government has locked ability to borrow more from the IMF, the World Bank, and other foreign governments. Without any explanation how will we end up affording more? Is all these things we are doing.
And this is a country that used to have a budget of 300 billion at some point.
Imagine.
I think when Moi left power.
Imagine, and now we are borrowing from one line of borrowing, 200 plus billion. So
with projection of 600 plus billion.
Imagine. And you look at now the mix. Right now, I don't know whether the calculation is right, but 2024, the mix of foreign versus domestic is at 50-50. Again, what I've said is quite dangerous, but the government knows that.
So
and all these measures.
The effect that people are feeling is when you go to a bank, try to borrow money, go through the loan process, they decline. That's the effect of the government over borrowing, of borrowing aggressively.
And you
the
know,
interest rate, government borrowing aggressively.
For sure. And we have good examples to see what happened in Ghana.
Yeah.
It is exactly the same trend. There's nothing new. Same trend. When the Ghanaian government realized they were not going to be able to access loans from IMF, and you've seen what I've said, the IMF borrowing has been on a fairly constant movement. Only in 2025, you're seeing a serious spike upwards. And this spike upwards is actually estimates of the Kenyan government. Not what the IMF is going to give us, is what we estimate we're going to get from them. But we're basing our estimates on these things we're doing right now. So by then we can go and have an extra share. But you see, the IMF and the World Bank are very strenuous organizations in terms of how they borrow, because they are also playing a long game in terms of economic emancipation. So in Ghana, for example, the government stopped going to these institutions because of how rigorous the process was, and they decided to borrow commercially. And when you borrow, for example, for example, in this year, the government is saying it's going to, the government is saying, for example, by 2026, from international organizations, we are going to borrow 92 billion. Then from commercial, we are going to borrow the same year 168 billion. You know, the import of this is that you're likely to get this 168 billion in the commercial market than you are likely to get from the IMF, isn't it?
Yeah.
But because this money doesn't come with the restrictions that would ordinarily follow that kind of borrowing, what will happen is that this amount of money we borrow, 168 billion, you remember, it's money that has come into Kenya without a lot of conditions, but yet it will be repaid.
Yeah.
So if these loans, for example, are 10-year, 15-year, or 20-year, whatever period it is, at the point it gets to that place, are we likely to have the 168 billion invested in a project that we can actually see?
No.
So we'll have actually spent it, but someone else has to pay it. And that's exactly what's happening right now. When people say our ideology does not allow this kind of life, is because now you're going to a place where those who were supposed to pay have become of age. Someone who was born in 2000, for example, how old are they right now?
24 years.
24.
Yeah.
So people who, when Kibaki took power, they were not born. How old are they right now?
22 actually. When Kibaki took power, 22.
So the population that is affected is larger than the population that doesn't care. And unfortunately, this population has no one else to pass it forward to. There is no way you'll start a family when you cannot afford your own life. So it's a question for me. I think it should not be thought about simplistically as people are doing it. And I've seen leaders saying, "Oh, Gen Zs are not reading; they have not."
Yeah.
There is no better educated generation
than this one.
All of us, on average, everyone has gone to school on the very minimum, KCSE. So there is no space to say that people are just being foolish and asking these questions.
In fact, education has been decentralized because I'm tempted to believe that the standard of education that people received before versus the level of information people have been exposed to before, I don't think comparing the educational certificate is fair.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And by the way, the other thing we discussed last time, decentralization of information has a way of shifting behavioral patterns. Now, for example, all these things we're discussing, 20 years ago, nobody knew where the numbers come from, is it?
Yes.
Now we can. We download and read for ourselves.
And how can people access this information?
You go to Treasury and search for, it's called the, let me get the correct name so that you search it as it is. If you go to the Treasury website and actually even on Google.
Yes.
Just search for estimates of revenue, grants, and loans, financial year 2024-25.
So you can actually see all they are planning in advance.
All, in fact, you will see that as the executive is getting 2.3 trillion, there are parastatals that the government has already said in their forecast, we don't expect any return from them. They've marked dash up 2027. But yet the government is getting allocation to put in those parastatals.
Yeah.
So, I mean, read for yourself, it's there. You know, and those are the things that I'm saying at the point of budget making, budget estimates.
Yes.
MPs should be very, very honest and say, during that time, how did we vote? And I hope someone can actually get and see how many MPs were in parliament that day when the estimates were brought. Did they raise concern about rationalizing numbers? But now they are the ones now perhaps who are saying
rejecting.
Oh, let us reject. We vote no.
Hypocrisy.
But even if you vote no for the Finance Act, and assuming we reject it completely, the government will still borrow because the estimates have been passed. You get? So we will perhaps not take it out of our pockets right now, but our children will pay for it in years to come.
They will still borrow. They already got what they want.
They will still borrow. They will still borrow because the government must meet its budget. So the deficit we see year on year, if you look at the processes, actually even they have publications for budget discussions. Those questions are asked. There are also some very prudent MPs. And you can see these questions being asked. Last year you started the housing levy. How much did you collect of the housing levy?
Yes.
How much more do you intend to collect from the housing levy this year? You would assume then, if you have a housing levy that we didn't have in 2022, then we should not be under as much pressure as we are going to 2024 because we actually have reduced this because people are actually paying more.
Yes.
But you can't say we didn't collect, we collect only 10%, 15%. Then instead of you saying we need more money to hire more people in KRA to help us manage this fund more, you want to take money, renovate offices for people and do all these things and still leave the Kenya Revenue Authority with the same people working for it to collect the same housing levy and expect a different solution?
No.
Unless we are not well. So even if the finance bill is rejected, the government has extra sources to get revenue. But you should start the conversation of the government being able to rationalize fast.
Yes.
They can even take finance bill 2023 and continue it into finance bill as it is in 2024, but increase their prudence of collection.
Okay. Ed, asante sana. I believe for the plans we had for this conversation, you've explained it very well. You've broken it down properly. And people can go check out on the Treasury website or just Google, the budget estimates, and we can actually trace back. Say everything is online, everything is available.
Absolutely.
You can trace back to the members of parliament who actually voted yes to the estimates, but are now voting no. Because they knew what that was. But you know what's exciting about this conversation that people are having now is Kenyans are now, Kenyans have opened their eyes to policy. Kenyans now, and I hope in the next election we'll be discussing ideas, not promises. We'll be discussing not tutawajengea barabara ama tutawaletea maji ama tutawaletea stima. We'll be discussing how does this idea help us. Like, yes, you're proposing this. Why are you getting the money? What is the return and what is the value people are going to get?
Absolutely.
That's the most exciting thing so far from this conversation.
For sure. It's a new space and watch space and ideology is going to change.
Okay.
The days when government just does things and justifies, we are running out of runway and you can see what's happening. If you look in Twitter, actually, even people who don't have the professional background to internalize some of this information, people understand. People see what it means.
Yes.
And therefore, what you're saying is actually what it's like to become.
Yes.
Our elections become more about accountability. We stop blaming external forces for all our problems. We have problems that are external, but let's deal with the internal ones first. And I think if we can get there, there will be a significant change in how we do politics in this country. As you can tell right now, there is no one dressing in political colors when going for the riot. It's ideology.
Yes.
Ideology. The decision to go for this protest is bigger than your political party. It's bigger than your parents. It's now a thing of ideology. I believe what other Kenyans believe. I feel how they feel.
Yeah.
And for me, I say would be very, very wrong or very, very naive for you not to just say, it's going to go away or you're going to bring as many police as possible. Because the conversations about ideology are fought by joining the ideology and trying to make a change from inside. They're not fought by abducting people, lobbying tear gas.
Yes.
Because if I need you to do all those things, you can lobby tears on Twitter.
Yes.
It's a space where people continuously speak about these things.
But they could ban Twitter.
Long shot.
Not possible.
Long shot. Even the most draconian states, it doesn't work like that.
So the shortcut is just listen to people and respond accordingly.
For sure. The government should find a way of getting to these spaces and start objectively discussing some of these issues and break down some of these policies. And sometimes in some places, by the government has good reasons why they're doing what they're doing. But now all these things are lost in translation because the government has assumed a position that we know it all. No one else can tell us.
Yeah.
They need to also accept that there's a chance for people to tell us how they feel and what they feel like. And the finance bill, by the way, as we reject it, unfortunately, it's going to be rejected with even some of the corrective measures that the government thinks, well thought out ideas of how they're going to figure out things. But you see, because the estimates are wrong, everything following the estimates cannot be right.
Okay.
If we get our estimations wrong, it's like if you budget wrong, everything else you do cannot be right because you budgeted from the wrong premise.
Yeah.
So I'm just hoping that we see how this plays out. But for me, I hope that we strongly come up with a very deep discussion on how to solve these issues out.
Okay. Yeah. Asante sana Ed.
Karibu.
Thank you for letting us fit in your busy schedule for another conversation. Our audience always enjoys vibes with you. Asante sana for making time for us again. Mkiwa na maswali zingine za Ed, please hapa kwa comment section tell us other issues that una feel bado anaweza vibe poa about. Otherwise, asante sana.
Karibu.
All right.